All right, looks like it's recording, and I will share my screen. All right, so Des asked a question about the question paper. So next week we do have our second unit exam starting. You should be able to see this screen. Someone let me know if you can't actually see it. It should be sharing right now, but it's not. Usually gives me like an outline around my screen, and it's not doing that at the moment. So let me know if it's not actually sharing the screen. So today is the 6th. We are covering Chapter 8. Next week we'll be covering Chapter 11, and then the unit exam opens on Wednesday, a little earlier than usual because we have fall break. So there's technically no classes those days, but your exam will be open over the course of those days. And the question paper, since I haven't actually got your grades out to you yet, well, some of you do have your grades on your question paper, but not everyone does. So since I haven't got all of those out yet, I will probably actually move this question paper due date to Saturday. But Des's question on the requirements being the same, the rubric being the same, yes, all the requirements are the same for the second question paper as well. So I'm going to, though, move the due date for that to the 17th. Just so that it gives everybody a chance to get their grades and make any changes as they're writing their second. So you can definitely start writing your second question paper at any point, but I definitely want to get your feedback for your first one to you. I apologize it's taken this long. It has been kind of a crazier semester than I expected, so I apologize for that. But yes, the rubric is the same for question paper number 2. Two sources at least. One is a peer-reviewed research article, and the second can be a peer-reviewed research article or some other reputable source. But yeah, I will change that, and so you should see that reflected in Canvas as well. I can actually probably do that really quickly, just moving it to the 17th, but keeping the times the same should be pretty quick. I'll just do that right now. Are there any other questions about logistics or things that are coming up? So you should be able to see, I realized for number 1, the rubric didn't actually appear like it was supposed to. So you should be able to see that now on all of them. And I will just change the due date for this to the 17th, and you should be able to see that reflected in yours as well. All right, so that should be done. The question paper has been moved to that Saturday. So the exam will still open on Wednesday the 14th, and it will remain open for more days than usual. So it'll be open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then it will close on Saturday. So that exam will cover chapters 4, 8, and 11, and we'll be covering chapter 8 today. All right, let me know if you've got any other questions about the schedule, about groups. Definitely let me know. Send me an email or message in the chat box to let me know if you have not been able to get in contact with your group. If you haven't been to class like the last 2 weeks, definitely go and watch the class lecture recordings, because I've gone over this project a couple times now, last week and the week before. So if you're So get caught up, and then you'll know what we're talking about the group project, and then you can get a group. Contact me and I'll help you get one. All right, so let's jump into more developmental psychology. So we stopped off at the end of, well, basically at birth. So we talked about teratogens last time, so let's jump into growth during infancy. And so you'll see some patterns throughout the chapter on development. Hopefully everybody at this point has read the chapter. So hopefully you saw some of those patterns that we were talking about last time, that the chapter kind of breaks up cognitive development, physical development, socio-emotional development, and we'll kind of do that same thing here at different periods. So infancy is one of the time periods that we know the most about. So a lot of researchers throughout time and a lot of medical practitioners as well have been really interested in infants and seeing how infants develop, how they change over time. So there's been a lot of work on development of infants. So definitely more than we can pack in one chapter or in just this class meeting. So there's definitely a lot more information out there too. So one interesting thing is that the physical growth, and I think I mentioned this last class period, is often discontinuous in infancy. So we tend to think of growth like size growth, like lengthening, so arms and legs, limbs growing. We tend to think of that as being kind of just a little bit at a time, so slowly you can't really tell, but it's actually quite discontinuous. So it happens in spurts. So this little baby will have, say, a growth spurt every couple weeks. And with that, well, on average, so this specific baby might not, it might have some more, a little bit more continuous growth. But on average, this baby would have a couple growth spurts every couple, or a growth spurt every couple weeks. So about 3 to 4 weeks, and then a growth spurt that usually happens over 24 or 48 hours, where a lot of size growth happens. So lengthening of limbs, lengthening of the trunk, widening and enlarging of the head. So it's really interesting that that is how it tends to happen with children. Let's put it in presentation mode as well. All right, here we go. So there can be quite a long time between growth spurts. So a doctor might not be nervous at all for infants. If you have a baby, you'll go in pretty frequently in the first couple of years of their life and get measured very frequently. They'll probably not be too concerned if from one to the next appointment they're not staying like on the same track. But if that's happening consistently, they'll look at that pattern and then they might be worried about it at that point. So the largest recorded measurements, so that might have been, there might be babies that do grow more than this, but the largest we have recorded is about 7/10 of an inch in length, so getting almost an inch taller in one single growth spurt, and a head circumference growth, so widening of the head, of 3/10 of an inch in one growth spurt. And so again, that usually happens between 24 and 48 hours. So that is dramatic growth within that amount of time. The average newborn is about 18 to 22 inches long, about 7.5 pounds. With that, usually newborns lose about 5 to 7% of their body weight in the first few days. And that's just a function of them adjusting to feeding outside of the womb. So they're learning to suck, to swallow, and then their digestive system is working more at this point. So after that first little period of losing some weight, they tend to grow really quickly. So 5 to 6 ounces per week and about 3/4 an inch per month in that first year. So that might all be within just one growth spurt. That might be 2 growth spurts within that month throughout the first year. So you might have seen these kind of growth charts. So growth slows at about age 2. So it's not as dramatic, but obviously if you've seen a 2-year-old compared to a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, you'll be able to know that the 2-year-old is growing quite a bit faster than, say, that 8-year-old. With that, at about age of 2, they're about 32 inches tall and about half of their adult height. So if you take a 2-year-old, and there's actually calculators online you can do this with. So if you take a 2-year-old and you measure their height, whether they are male or female, you can generally put into that calculator and it will give you a rough estimate of how tall that child will be in adulthood. And it's about double of what their height is at that point. So based on that, it looks like my daughter and my son will both be just a little bit shorter than me, but quite a bit taller than their mother. So that'll be interesting to see. And it looks like they will probably be within about an inch of each other. So that'll be fun. The older sister will be taller than her brother for essentially his whole life until he gets to adulthood. So I wonder if he'll be disappointed in that he doesn't, because he's 4 years younger than her. With that, another interesting thing that's happening now, similar to what was happening in prenatally is that the brain is developing quite a lot. So as we saw in those pictures of the brain growing, I think we actually have a picture from that all the way up to age of 2. But in infancy, there are still lots of neurons being developed and then migrating to specific areas. With that, if that creation of new neurons from stem cells really pretty much stops at about age 2, and the neurons that exist are essentially the same ones that you're going to live with your entire life. So you don't develop many new neurons after the age of 2. So with that, with the brain growing so much, with it learning so much, it is really important to protect babies from falls so that they don't have concussions, so they don't get injuries to their brain. So definitely don't shake babies, even if they won't stop crying or they won't sleep. I know that can be really frustrating, especially as a parent if you're not getting a lot of sleep yourself because the baby's sleep schedule seems so strange to you. Yeah, so sorry I didn't see this question earlier, Lindsay. Yes, it's pretty common for if you take a boy and girl that are the same age, so on average, the girl will be taller through childhood, and generally girls will hit puberty earlier than boys. And so generally a girl will be taller than a boy until basically adulthood, basically till that boy hits puberty and then gets taller than the girl. So, but yeah, it's pretty common for girls to be taller throughout all of childhood and then in through adolescence, and then not till the boy is in the process of puberty or even finished will they on average then be taller than a girl. So sorry if I was confusing beforehand. So yeah, definitely with my daughter being 4 years older than her little brother, she's definitely going to be taller than him. I mean, they might end up the same height just because it's based on a lot of things, based on the epigenetics as well, the things they're eating today. Like today, my son just did not eat any of his dinner. So that does not lend itself well to growing very tall. So with that, back to the brain development though. So by the second birthday, about that time, all the neurons are there. So the cells themselves are there, and the brain is about 75% of the adult weight. So if all the neurons are there at about the second birthday, what do you think that additional weight is within the brain in between age 2 and adulthood? So just type your answer in the chat, or you can shout it out through your microphone as well. But if there's not really new neurons being developed after that point, where does that weight come from in the brain? That's a good guess, Parker, saying the skull, but I'm talking specifically about the brain within the skull. So not just the head overall, but the actual brain itself. So by about the second birthday, the brain itself is about 75% the adult weight. So what else is happening that makes that brain heavier? So Richard mentions glial cells, and Christopher mentions blood vessels. So it definitely could be blood vessels, and it's definitely related to cells. I'm not sure specifically what you're meaning by the glial cells, though, Richard. Like, how are those making it more weight, way more? Just that those might be holding more of the structure of the brain. Is that what you're referring to? So there might be more of those, and that might make it weigh a little more. Yeah, definitely possible. So adding glial cells and blood vessels can be a part of it. Most of the weight, though, is actually from adding new dendrites. So the axon branches and dendrites to make new connections in the brain, which is really interesting. So even though all the neurons might be in place, so however many tens of thousands of your neurons are in this area of the brain right here needs to get connected up to this area. And so new dendrites will form, new axon branches, more connections all over. And that is what makes up that last part of the weight. So I think that really goes to show how many connections are going to be created in the brain. And it's also really remarkable, because we'll talk in a second, that at about age 2 as well, a lot of pruning starts to happen. So um, let me see if I've got a good picture of a neuron right here. Yep, right here. So here is the dendritic spreading. So this is about how much the dendrites and the neurons are connected up at birth versus 1 month versus 3 months, 15, and then 2 years. You can see how many more dendrites are there. So the neurons at about, you're going to be adding neurons throughout this time, but most of the weight difference is going to be all these branches of connections between different neurons. So what that means is that more parts of the brain will be able to speak to each other. This is going to happen as the child is learning, observing, things like that. So it's pretty neat. And then pruning is essentially at about age 2, a baby is, or a young child is making tons of connections, and then connections that aren't used, kind of like pruning a tree, that dendrite branch will just be reabsorbed into the neuron. So it gets pruned off. It doesn't actually like get cut off like a tree, but that's what it's called, is pruning. So that dendrite branch is reabsorbed because it's not being used. So it conserves the energy of that cell, which is pretty neat. So to study the brain in infants, it can be pretty difficult. PETs use X-rays, which can be pretty quick and shouldn't do too much damage from that radiation. MRIs require a patient to be still. So with infants, that can be really difficult to have an infant be still unless they're under anesthetic. But that's not generally something you want to do for children. EEGs are pretty good, and they measure the electrical activity of different areas of the brain. So it's not going to give you as much data, or it's not going to give you the same kind of data that an MRI would, but it can still give you some good idea. And then functional near-infrared spectroscopy, it also works pretty well, and that's FNIRS. So essentially that's like an X-ray, but instead rather than shooting X-ray radiation, you are shooting in near-infrared light, essentially. So just another wavelength of light, and then you have sensors to pick that up. So with that, a baby can move with that on to be able to measure their brain activity. So one interesting aspect of motor development that I always like to cover, especially in infancy, is reflexes. So these are built-in reactions to stimuli. These seem to be built into our genetic code because they seem to have survival value. So not all of them make a lot of sense in today's modern world, but if you look back to our evolutionary past, you might see why some of these could be really useful. One that still makes a whole lot of sense is the rooting reflex. And that is when an infant will move its head towards any touch on its face or cheek and try to start sucking on whatever that was touching it. So whether that's a nipple, whether that's a binky, whether it's your finger, they will naturally, when they feel that, try to go and turn to suck on that. And that's one reflex that helps them feed and live, essentially. So that's why that is programmed into genetics. The sucking reflex itself, if there's anything in their mouth, whether it's a mouth or whether it's a nipple, a pacifier, or a Lego, a baby will suck on that. So keep Legos away from babies because they'll try to, keep them away from young children too, because they'll try to eat them. The Moro reflex, there's quite a few reflexes. Your book goes into more detail on a lot more of these. The Moro reflex is actually my favorite reflex. Maybe I'm a terrible person, but I always like to startle my young children because the Moro reflex is when they will quickly flail their arms, spread out, and they'll get a really surprised look and try to grab whatever's around them. So that is a reflex thought to come from our far evolutionary past when the ancestors of humans were still in trees. So if we get dropped or fall off of a parent who's holding us in a tree and we flail our arms out, it makes it a lot easier to catch those limbs and survive another day. So, but it is a funny reflex to startle a baby and have them spread out like that. Yeah, I would do that just to my kids, and maybe that's why they got so scared today when all the phones in the house went off with an Amber Alert. I don't know. Maybe I traumatized them as children. But that is another example of a reflex, something that's built into our genetics that we don't have to learn, that our bodies just do as infants. That one is lost pretty quickly, the Moro reflex, within the first couple months. Others, like the sucking reflex, that stays for a little longer. Some reflexes expire really quickly. But all of these reflexes, all this moving, really goes into building infants' gross motor skills. So you can see here for these ages in months, kind of the general timeline on average of when children develop certain skills. So lifting head, being able to lift their chest up, roll over, support their own weight a little bit, stand, pulling themselves to standing, walking with furniture for support, these kinds of things. So think of gross motor skills as things using big muscle groups. So using the leg muscles, using chest muscles, using arm muscles. Fine motor skills are using smaller, more fine precision things like your hands and your fingers to do. So moving arms, walking, and with this, for a lot of the learning that happens with infants, a lot of it is just trial and error. They're developing their perceptual abilities with their eyes, their ears, their sense of balance. These kinds of things are all developing at the same time. So having the opportunity to roll around, to move around, to test out their bodies in that way is going to be the most helpful for them learning how to move and build these gross motor skills. So keeping them in a crib lying down or strapped in a car seat for a long period of time isn't going to help them develop these gross motor skills. Fine motor skills, like using your fingers to pick up a spoon, manipulate buttons, those don't happen as early on as these gross motor skills, but they come in the similar kinds of ways. Playing with objects, trying to reach and grab for objects. Obviously, that gross motor skill of moving an arm forward needs to be there before the ability to actually like pinch that object. So with that, a lot of books or videos or programs will try to encourage parents to teach their child these things, or like get to walking really quickly, or be able to be a genius baby, or things like that. Really, while some of those tools that they're using might be really useful, the thing that infants really need is the opportunity to socialize, to be around people and see how people interact, see faces. They need to hear sounds. They need to see different sights and colors, need to be able to move, need to be able to pick up simple toys. So things like blocks are great. So simple, colorful, they can pick them up, move them around, manipulate them, rattles, things like that. So simple toys and the opportunity to explore their environment are some of the most important things for infant development. You don't need the specialist toy for children on average, right? So if there's a child with any kind of specific developmental disorder, then maybe some kind of specific toy tailored to that specific thing might be helpful. But in general, on average, simple toys providing objects, spoons, like big kitchen spoons, things like that, are the best. Watching and playing with a child, that's very helpful because of mirror neurons. We talked about that many weeks ago, how humans have the ability to essentially run through the behaviors that they observe someone else doing. So if you, as a parent, go and pick up a block, let's say this is a block, or something like that, the child watching you, their mirror neurons, will work through that same process, and that will help them then be able to go and pick up that block. So even if they don't have the fine motor skills yet to actually pick it up and manipulate it, it will help with that observational learning. So this is a good short video on transitions of different times in developmental periods of what kind of gross and fine motor skills should be possible. So let's watch this really quickly.
Gross motor skills help infants get around in their environment. Here, 2-week-old Anna Marie displays a crawling motion and tries to pick up her head. Mac, who is 3 months old, can hold his head up and push with his arms quite well.
So I know that was really short clips, but hopefully you can see how the motions that this infant is doing are very, very similar to the motions that this infant is doing. So those kind of gross motor skills, essentially they need practice, having toys in front of them to motivate movement. Those kinds of things are very useful and important for children of this age.
Alex, who's 5 months old, demonstrates his preference for being upright by jumping with support from his father. He also provides a striking example of infant motivation as he tries to crawl toward the rattle. Here's Hannah at 7 months. She crawls, rolls, starts to balance in a sitting position, which permits her to transfer objects from hand to hand and hold 2 objects at once. Here she pulls to a stand. 8-month-old Randy sits with good balance and crawls with a toy in his hand. Randy can also stand up with a little help from his mother. New motor accomplishments change the way parents interact with their child. For example, parents' expressions of affection and game playing increase as their independently moving baby seeks them out for greetings, hugs, and entertainment.
So that was a really quick statement in this video that as the physical capacities of the child increase, so this child is now able to run around and chase this toy, it changes the socio-emotional environment that that child is in. So this is referring to the systems that we were talking about before, so how different things are bidirectionally interactive. So as this child has the new biological capacity to run, that means now the parents or caregivers or peers can also run or play in new ways. And so that's going to open up new possibilities for further development that wasn't possible beforehand. So it's kind of this, all these systems working together to allow new different things that a child can learn.
And babies' expressions of delight as they work on new motor competencies trigger pleasure in others. This encourages the child's efforts further. Fine motor development has to do with smaller movements, such as reaching and grasping. Here, 2-week-old Anna Marie directs her arms toward a rattle. These movements are called pre-reaching because they resemble poorly coordinated swipes or swings. 6-week-old Kara swipes at an object in front of her. Around 3 months.
So what's happening here, and you might be able to see when comparing these infants, so one that's very close to newborn as compared to, I think they said this child was 3 months old. So you know already there are still neurons being developed in this baby. There are still neurons being developed from stem cells and migrating in this baby, but also there's a ton of dendrites connecting up. So the neurons specifically that are connected to the muscles in the arms, so those are getting better at sending signals to those gross motor muscles as well as those fine motor muscles. So part of this learning of being able to do gross motor skills is the neurons talking to the muscles and the connection of the brain itself. So essentially practicing makes perfect. So we've got a infant that is kind of a little bit, you might be able to say, swiping at this thing, versus this infant is definitely swiping. And then we'll see the next infant is able to even go and grasp objects. But it's the same process. Those neurons connecting up to other neurons, neurons connecting up to different muscles, the perceptual capacities to be able to direct eyes to things, being able to perceive that object as well. So all of these components of our development have to like match up and to be able to do these pretty complicated tasks. So pretty cool.
Around 3 months, voluntary reaching begins and gradually improves. Here, 5-month-old Alex demonstrates reaching with the ulnar grasp, a clumsy motion in which the fingers close against the palm. Then, Alex explores the object with his mouth. Randy's hands have become coordinated enough at age 8 months to hold and explore objects smoothly and effortlessly. 11-month-old Nicole uses the pincer grasp, thumb against the forefinger, to pick a raisin out of her father's hand. Of all motor skills, voluntary reaching is believed to play the greatest role in infant cognitive development, since it opens up a whole new way of exploring the environment. Once reaching and grasping are mastered, they combine with the child's developing cognition and desire to solve new problems, leading to even more advanced manipulation of objects. 23-month-old Zachary is intent on figuring out how to put shapes into the box. 15-month-old Braxton shows off his carpenter skills. And finally, Zach stuffs a carpenter skills.
So it's another good example of probably observational learning to know how to use a hammer to hit these pegs. So a person in this room, a caregiver, a parent, probably did that with a toy similar to this, or even in this specific situation. Obviously, that kind of thing, like hitting toys on things, can come also just from a child doing that on their own and just swinging things around, but it might also be observational learning there.
And finally, Zach stuffs a Nerf ball into a cup and then intently tries to dig it out with a spoon. Kristen's genetic makeup, due to Down syndrome, has limited her rate of motor development. She developed more slowly than is typical, but her early experiences also had a profound effect. Because she had repeated surgeries to correct a heart defect, she lay on her back throughout her first 2 years. When finally she did move about, she did so by scooting instead of crawling. Today, Kristen's parents are teaching her to crawl and walk with the help of a walker. Parental love, involvement, attention, and rich stimulation are helping Kristen develop not just motorically, but in all respects.
The union of perceptual and motor information is dramatically evident in babies' developing sensitivity to depth. Here we see 5-month-old Alex, not yet able to crawl, showing no fear of careening over the drop-off. 7-month-old Hannah, an experienced crawler, perceives the visual edge and stops. She has begun to understand depth at an edge and its consequences for falling. 12-month-old Bailey backs away from the edge immediately. He knows what lies ahead if he continues. And 15-month-old Braxton, who's been walking for a while, has figured out how to get over the edge by turning around and sliding down, with a little help from Professor Burke.
So hopefully that will give you some ideas of fine motor skills, gross motor skills, as well as some visual examples of what to expect at different age ranges, and how some of the motor skills that you develop at the beginning are related to those motor skills that you'll develop in more detail later on. So this is also, like it said, related to both the sensation and perception. So when in the womb, a fetus is not, they have their eyes, but they're not able to actually see much, kind of a sense of light and dark. But there's not really so much color as well. With that, there is sound for the fetus. So some of their senses are more attuned at the time they're born. So hearing is a lot more attuned versus the sense of sight is not very well attuned right at birth. So with sensation, we had a whole chapter on sensation and perception. So sensation, again, is the information coming through those sensory organs, through our receptor cells, hair cells in our ears, versus rods and cones in our eyes. And then the perception is, well, what does this sound mean? Is that sound human talking? Is that sound a fan in the room? Is that sound a cat? You know, that kind of thing. What are we seeing? Are we seeing a shape, a color, a pattern? So these are perceptions that need to be tested out and developed over time. So it's very hard to study sensation and perception in infants because they can't really report. They can't tell you what they're seeing, what they're hearing. They can't explain it, right? So a lot of research for infants looks at the behaviors they're doing. It's very behaviorist in this. And so what they might do is use the visual preference method. And what that is watch what a child is looking at for longer periods of time. If you put a red block and a blue block in front of them and they're staring longer at the red block, then they might like that red block more, right? So you're looking at that visual preference. So another way to do that as well is habituation and dishabituation. So you can present a stimulus until a child's not very interested in it anymore. So if you want to know if a child can tell the difference between, let's say, this blue in this painting back here versus the teal of the wall versus the blue of my shirt, because those are a couple different shades. But if you want to know if an infant can tell the difference between those, you can give them a couple shapes with the color of the blue in this painting back here. So give them, let's say, 3 or 4 blocks, and then wait until they get disinterested. So they're habituated. They're not interested in it being a novel thing anymore. And then you can say, well, let's see if they can tell this blue versus this teal or the blue of my shirt. So then you, in those 3 blocks that are this blue, you add in a new block that's the color of my shirt. If they are more interested in the blue of my shirt block, you'll know, oh, they're probably able to see the difference there. Let's say it's all like square blocks, they're all the same shape and size, but the only difference is that color, and they're more interested in the new color. You might know at that point, well, it seems that some evidence that they can tell the difference between those blues. So that's what this habituation and dishabituation is. You can't ask them, hey, does this look like a different color? Well, you can ask them that, but they're not going to give you a relevant response. So give them a bunch of stimulus with this blue, then give them a new stimulus with this blue and see if they can discriminate between the old and new stimulus. You can do the same kind of thing with sounds to tell what frequencies a child can distinguish. If they're listening to a certain frequency or a certain volume level, then give them a slightly different one, see if their behavior changes, if they're more interested in that. That can let you know a little bit of what they are able to identify and differentiate. So another thing that we've got now are these really fancy eye trackers. So this is basically a machine. Both of these are machines to watch where a child's pupils are going and where they're looking. Essentially, you can get a heat map So you'll be watching this child and see, are they looking at this yellow character or this blue character for longer? Do they look blue, yellow, back to blue? It's pretty interesting what you can do with that, because with this kind of setup that this child here has, they can be moving around, say, a playroom or around other children, and you can watch where their eye is going, because it's got a camera to see what the child sees and the software to be able to track where their pupil is. So that's another way to do that visual perception or that visual interest and just take it up a level, essentially. So what do infants see? It seems like infants are quite nearsighted at birth. So here we've got about what we think a 1-month-old can see versus 2-month-old versus 3-month-old versus 1-year-old. So at 1-year-old, you're pretty close to adult levels of vision, or you can be. But at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, it's not very clear. Also, you're very nearsighted. It appears you're very nearsighted right after birth. So you've got about 20/40 vision at 6 months old. So 6-month-olds probably have better vision than me. So good job, 6-month-olds. Although it's not that difficult to have better vision than me. So what do infants see? One interesting thing is they don't perceive occluded objects as one solid object. So this cat, they wouldn't necessarily be able to trace that, oh, well, this is a cat back there. There's some shape over here versus a shape over here. And so a lot of that seems to come from basically practice, by learning that objects can pass in front of other objects, and you can see part of it and the other part of it. So now this water bottle is occluded by my arm. I almost just poured my water out on me. That would have been funny. Maybe. They can start tracking that and noticing that this object consistency at about 3 months. So depth perception, we saw a little bit of that in the video, that visual cliff. So to test this, researchers took like a plate of plexiglass and a clear visual cliff, like something where it's really obvious that there is a drop off here, and let the baby crawl. So in this kind of case, they're safe. It's plexiglass. They're not actually going to fall. It's really interesting to watch these videos. You can definitely look these up, visual perception, depth perception in infants, and see the difference between a 3-month-old, a 6-month-old, an 8-month-old, because as they get older, they very clearly can tell that edge and will stop and not continue forward, versus a 3 or 4-month-old might just go out onto this plexiglass. So when they do that in a home, they do things like fall down the stairs or fall off a couch and things like that. And that's one of the ways they learn. Obviously, we don't want them falling down the stairs or falling off couches. But that is one way that we learn these things. Oh, I do have one linked, but I don't think we'll watch it right now. We don't have a lot of time. So for hearing, fetuses in the last 2 months in the womb can hear sounds. It seems like we might, as humans, be able to recognize patterns in sound. So let's say you're very frequently listening to the same couple songs, or you play specific music for the baby when they're in the womb. They might be able to recognize those same patterns afterwards. The tones are going to sound different in the womb versus out, but babies do seem like they are able to recognize those patterns. With that, we are very attuned to human speech. So the pitch, the timbre, the volume, the rhythm of human speech, humans are really good genetically and evolutionarily, really good at picking out those sounds that human speech matches. So with that, though, it is really hard for infants to hear really soft sounds until about 3 months old. So while a lot of people like to talk really softly to very young babies, sometimes it's actually better for them to talk slightly louder. So I'm not talking about yelling at a newborn baby. You don't want to go over to like your new niece and start yelling in their face. But talking a little bit louder than you would just generally talk to someone in a room can make it easier for a baby to pick up and attune to that human speech and then learn a little bit quicker. So, all right, so let's jump up to early childhood. Again, with essentially only having a chapter on development and only a couple class periods, we can't go into a ton of detail for every single age range, but hopefully we'll hit a couple key pieces that are relevant to a lot of people, and knowing what children and adolescents, young adults, and later adults are going through. So in early childhood, an average child grows about 2.5 inches a year and gains about 5 to 7 pounds a year. So with that, girls will, oh, I guess I was wrong earlier. Girls will be slightly smaller on average until about puberty. And again, girls will hit puberty on average a little earlier, and then they will be quite a bit taller until boys enter and then get midway or even finish puberty. So body variations do occur in early children. So some children will be a little bit shorter, a little bit slimmer, a little bit wider, a little bit broader. Most of that is due to heredity in early childhood. But nutrition can help with healthy growth as well. So if there's a lot of unhealthy foods being consumed, that's going to affect growth and the way the growth is happening. But generally in early childhood, a lot of the size differences that you see, most of that is coming from genetics. Brain development is having a really big influence on cognitive development in early childhood. So like we mentioned, at about age 2, the size of the brain with neurons themselves, there's not really many new neurons being created from stem cells after age 2. It kind of really tapers off at that point and just stops, except for a few key areas in the brain. So the overall size doesn't change much, but it is getting a lot more dense with connections between neurons. And so with that, that's going to affect a lot of the cognitive capacities that early children have. So some interesting things. Low income is correlated to less density in the brain, so less connections, and maternal sensitivity, so like maternal caring and quick responsiveness to the needs of a child is correlated to more density in the brain. So that's a risk factor with being low income, but a protective factor with maternal sensitivity. And I would assume as well that that sensitivity doesn't have to be maternal. It could be any parent or any caregiver would do that as well. And that would make sense because in a low income area, the child might not have, or in a low-income household, the child might not have as much access to as many toys. They might have to be in, say, a car seat more while a parent is working or something like that, not able to explore as much, versus with that extra maternal sensitivity, a caregiver taking more care to respond to the needs of a child, giving them more toys, giving them more opportunities to explore and see things around them, will lend their brain to developing more connections. So that is, when we're talking about things like risk factors and protective factors, I think that's a really good example of how being low income in infancy and early childhood can be a risk factor, but having maternal sensitivity in early childhood can be a good protective factor, or protect against some of those risks and problems that might occur. So another thing is that the brain is starting to myelinate. It starts kind of around the brainstem and then towards the back of the brain and then slowly towards the front of the brain. So the myelination itself doesn't actually finish until about age 23, but it is happening all through childhood. So the prefrontal cortex is growing dramatically during this time. And a lot more connections are being made there, a lot of dendrites connecting up. Does anybody remember what the prefrontal cortex does? We've got problem solving, thoughts and reasoning. Yep, I would say problem solving for sure. Reasoning definitely. I think with thought, you're maybe describing like thinking ahead, so planning, and that is absolutely right. So yeah, the prefrontal cortex is really important for a lot of our social behavior that we're going to be developing through later life. So it's really important to have, say, like proper nutrition and the opportunity to make these new connections and test out things in early childhood. So very good. You might have noticed as well, the prefrontal cortex comes up nearly every week and every chapter. So maybe something to make sure that you remember is, what does the prefrontal cortex do generally, and what is it, when does it finish developing, things like that, or myelinating. So this is a graph of the synaptic pruning that happens in childhood. So there's a lot of dendrites and a lot of connections. Basically, the brain starts making a ton of connections that we don't necessarily need. So it's like a tree putting out tons and tons of roots, and then when it finds water in a couple specific areas, the tree might stop using a lot of those roots and let some of those roots die. Similar kinds of things. The brain puts out tons of dendrites all over the place. We actually have more dendrite connections around the age of 2 than we do in adulthood. So the brain's putting out tons of arms or feelers, and then whatever is getting signals back, those connections are kept. The rest of them are reabsorbed and pruned away to save those neurons from having to maintain the rest of those dendrites. So you can see here in the visual cortex, so for vision, lots of dendrite connections, and then about at 1 year is when a lot of pruning starts to happen there. For the prefrontal cortex, a lot of those dendrites are still being developed even into age 3, and then they start to be pruned back a lot more. And then for the auditory cortex for hearing, we see about age 2 is when there starts to be some pruning, and then it just kind of keeps going down into adulthood. So one interesting thing too is in adulthood, you can regain or recreate new connections in any of these areas. So you might not need to in, say, the visual cortex, because by that time in adulthood, you've probably been seeing for a long time. Your cortex, your visual cortex, kind of knows exactly what it needs to do to see. But for something like the prefrontal cortex or other areas of your brain, for, say, memory, you can develop new dendrite connections there. And so depending on the kinds of tasks or skills or training or activities that you're doing, you can actually observe the density of people's brains getting more dense in, say, the prefrontal cortex or areas that are storing memories, even in adults, which is pretty neat. It won't get back to this level ever that we see at about age 2, but you can still increase your connections in your brain. So motor development is really important in early childhood for cognitive development and for social development. So moving around the environment in early childhood should be pretty automatic, should be pretty easy. So think here of, say, like a 4-year-old able to run around, maybe able to play some games, so kick a ball, try to catch a frisbee, things like that. So age 3 should be able to do things like hop, jump, run. Age 4, probably getting better at climbing. Maybe at a park, they might be testing their limits, doing things that you might not want them to do, like jumping off the couch or trying to jump in between couches, or trying to step on a fan and like hop between the couch and the fan and the other couch. It's really specific because that happened today with my 3, almost 4-year-old. So definitely testing limits of physical capacity, and I don't want any broken bones for him. So at age 5, you'll see they're much more adventurous, much more willing to take physical risks. So with that, if children aren't meeting these benchmarks, if they're not able to hop when other children are hopping, or not able to run, or not able to jump between 2 things, they're not going to be able to do some kinds of games that children do. So when my son was younger, his sister was trying to teach him how to do hopscotch, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't do hopscotch. It was beyond his capacity. So she just went and played without him, right? So that same kind of thing can happen within peer groups if a child isn't meeting these benchmarks. And so when they're not being put into sports, when they're not able to play with their peers, they might have lower self-worth, lower motivation for things like sports in the future, not as much opportunity to try out different social skills that they're learning. So these gross motor skills are important benchmarks to watch for and help children reach so that they can essentially interact with other children in the world. So fine motor development at age 3 is still pretty clumsy. They should at that point be able to pick things up with their fingers pretty well, but they probably at age 3 can't build a Lego creation like this. So at age 4, probably more precise, more capable of maneuvering things the way that they want. And then age 5, they should have pretty highly developed coordination. Probably at that point, you might be able to expect a Lego creation like this from a 5-year-old. All right, so we're going to jump quite far ahead. So we were talking about early childhood there, and we're going to jump completely over middle childhood, not because it's not important, not because there's not a lot of research on it, because it actually has a ton of research on it. But some of the aspects of adolescence I think we'll jump to just for time's sake and start learning about this. Also, I think I may have skipped over attachment. Or maybe I'm going to go through, oh, I see, yep, physical, and then I'll go cognitive and socio-emotional. So we will go back to those earlier stages, and we will talk about other aspects. We're touching on cognitive and socio-emotional development, but most of this right here, we are focused on physical development. So let's talk about the physical development of adolescence. And so the biggest thing developing physically at this point is, well, a lot of parts of the body because of puberty. So generally puberty occurs between the ages of 9 and 16, and the onset of puberty seems to be programmed into our genes. And so here we've got the average onset of puberty and for different aspects of it. So height growth spurt or growth of breasts or growth of pubic hair. So here is the average onset and the average completion, and the basically range when this might occur or when this can occur. So menarche, and yep. Then we've got for males, height spurt, penile growth, testicular development, and growth of pubic hair. So you can kind of see here on females, all of these are starting earlier. So here we've got a lot of things starting on average at about age 12 for male, versus 11 and even possible to have growth of different aspects of the body even as early as age 8. So I'll just flip back and forth. You can always pause, well, watch over the video again or look at the slides and look at it in more detail. So with that, it does seem that the age of puberty or the onset of puberty is happening earlier and earlier than it was in previous generations. So how might this affect the lives of girls specifically, let's say socio-emotionally, going through puberty early as compared to late? So what might the experience be of a girl that's going through puberty early versus a girl that's going through puberty late? What kind of socio-emotional factors might be at play there? So this one probably would require like talking through a microphone. You don't need to use your video, but if you want to, go ahead. But just think about that for a minute and see if you've got an idea of how might it be different for socio-emotionally for a girl that's going through puberty early versus late. So Don put a really good point in the chat. Des also has some good points here. So Don mentions attention, that a girl going through puberty, I would assume early is what you're referring to as well, Don. So a girl going through puberty early might be getting attention that they're not mentally prepared for. Yeah, so an early maturing girl might be getting attention from older peers, from older people who want to say, date this girl, even though she might be quite young, maybe getting that kind of attention from older people. Another one, Des is saying, embarrassed, depending on their community, it can be traumatizing and cause some withdrawal. So yeah, especially so a lot of times we see that in late maturing girls, is that there's a lot of embarrassment in the community, but it can also, depending on the context of community, it can happen for earlier developing girls as well. So any other additional comments? I guess maybe let's take a vote. So for girls versus, so female versus male, and early and late developing, what do you think is, on average, what do you think will be the highest risk factor or lead to maybe the most negative outcomes? So for girls, do you think it would be early puberty or late puberty? And for males, so for females versus males, do you think it will be early versus late puberty that will lead to the most potential risk factors? So anyone and everyone can type in their guess. Let's wait a minute as more responses come in. It looks like we're on a good track. So it looks like so far everybody is responding about the same thing from what I'm reading, that for females, early puberty is probably a higher risk of problems, and for so for females early, for males late. And that actually turns out to be the case, is that for females, early puberty tends to lead to more risk factors, attention from older peers, for example. They are expected, because physically they look different, they're expected to take on roles that they may not be ready for as well, versus late maturing males tend to have more embarrassment and more basically social stigma if they're maturing later. Their voice is still higher, their body hasn't changed like their peers, so things like that. So yeah, really good. So Des mentions reading a post on Reddit where a girl started puberty early and also really soon after her mother had passed away. And that caused a lot of shame because she wasn't sure how to talk about it or what, and probably didn't have maybe as many resources, especially right after that. Maybe family is still having a hard time dealing with the death in the family, and so maybe not paying as much attention to this child or teenager as well. So that could be quite a few risk factors combining at the same time. But yeah, good thoughts or guesses, or you read the chapter and saw that in the chapter, so that's good too. So early maturing girls are more likely, again, these are correlational studies. You can't really have an experimental study like this, right? You cannot cause girls to mature earlier, like one group to mature earlier versus one to mature later. So these are like correlational results. So early maturing girls are more likely to, so it's correlated to the higher likelihood of smoking, drinking, eating disorders, early dating, and early sexual experiences. So late maturation for boys is similar in different kinds of risk factors that it leads to. All right, so let's watch this video on brain development in adolescence. So that's a good question, Richard. So and good to get to before jumping into this about brain development. So menarche is the onset of a first period. And so do we know why the age of menarche is going down? There's a few different ideas, but it doesn't seem like it's only just one thing. Part of it might be some epigenetics. Part of it seems to be diet. So today across the world generally people have a lot more access to fat, so in their diet. And so especially when there's obesity, so obesity is highly correlated to early start of puberty overall, not just menarche, but all other aspects of puberty in females. So it seems to be the access of the nutrition that's available today that wasn't in generations past. It might be epigenetic as well. So those are two of the biggest culprits. Another idea is maybe hormones that are fed to animals or put into food as well might be related to it. So, but it's kind of hard to disentangle those two things, the nutrition overall versus the hormones themselves. You can't, it's hard because you can't do a really controlled experiment to disentangle those and give some people just foods with the, say, higher fat and better nutrition content, and then others the foods with the more modern hormones that we use, right? So it can be hard to disentangle those, but it seems to be a little bit epigenetic, a lot about diet and the nutrition that's available now, and maybe hormones in foods as well. That is leading to it. Yeah, it is really interesting. Maybe a good thing to do a question paper on and see if there are more findings that even I'm not aware of at this point too. But those are some of the ideas of why the age of menarche is going down over the generations. All right, so let's watch this video on brain development in adolescence, because this has a lot to do with the socio-emotional development of adolescence. Yeah, so Christopher, the growth hormones to animals as well as things that you put in food as well, and the genetic modification of food that could all have, like vegetables and things, could all have an effect. But again, it can be hard to disentangle that versus the nutrition that's available today and the fats that are available today as well.
Being a teenager is hard, and so is living with one, I'm told. No human gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase, and interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster than we do. And you may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now, or about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. There's someone had told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine or sweat glands get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled than their hormones than you might think. There are other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep. Sleep is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that your pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late in the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones.
So this is a good example of one aspect of development that has other effects socio-emotionally. So I just want to get anyone who thinks they had the earliest high school start time, just put the time that your high school started. So mine wasn't actually that early. Oh man, now I'm trying to recall. All right, we have, oh, that one's pretty early. So we've got an answer of 7:10, 7:30. So that is quite early, both of those, 7:10, 7:30. Mine, I'm thinking, wasn't actually, the first period's bell wasn't actually till like 8:20. 7:30, 7:20. So we've got 7:10, 7:20, 7:30. 5:45 a.m. So that is quite early because of one of the classes. So something before, like a class probably before the rest of the school periods. So I know I had, say, a band class that during one season of the year had an earlier thing. But yeah, 5:45 definitely wins for the earliest. But yeah, 7:10, 7:20, 7:30, that is still incredibly early. So adolescents in high school, generally they should be going to sleep around midnight. So a little bit before, a little bit after, and waking up around 8 or 9 a.m. So if you're already in school, in classes at that time, it can make it really hard to focus. So it can make it really hard to learn, to take that information in, to socialize with people. So it can really impact children or adolescents negatively to have that kind of early class times. I remember one way that it affected me particularly was with waking up at that time. I would always fall asleep around 2 in the afternoon. So I remember one year I was really excited to take a physics class. So, and the only time it was offered was right after lunch, and that is when I tended to just fall asleep. So I fell asleep in that class, even though I was so excited. It was one of the classes I was most looking forward to because they did experiments and it was cool stuff to talk about. I fell asleep almost every single day of it was either my junior or senior year, just because of this sleep schedule. and being to school so early. Whereas if that time was pushed back, wouldn't have been nearly as bad. So for children, having a little earlier start times isn't as bad, isn't as negative. My daughter has an online class meeting that she's got to be to at 8 a.m. and I hate that. It's too early for me to try and get her fed and everything before that class meeting. But it's not actually that bad of a time at 8 o'clock. So for younger children, that's fine. For adolescents, later in the morning would be better. All right, well, let's continue learning about other aspects of neurology and specifically about risk-taking in adolescence.
More focused students. So we got.
Oh, also, if anyone is interested, I did fail that physics class. One of the only classes I failed in high school. But I was so excited for it. It was really disappointing that I failed it. I mean, if you're asleep through a whole class, it can be really hard to pass.
Got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep to contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults, for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those lines of communication, are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain, where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting to peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connections that you don't use enough in a process called synaptic pruning, which has led to a theory that this is kind of a use it or lose it phase. Meaning, adolescence could be an especially important time to use your brain, play an instrument, engage in sports, write poetry, learn a language. Because by doing these things, you're helping hardwire those synapses and giving your brain topiary a lovely, lasting shape. Whereas if you're sitting around all day playing Candy Crush, those will be the connections that survive, which you don't need. This shaping of the teen brain manifests itself in other ways too, like in teenage attitudes. A group of scientists at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts once hooked up a group of adults and a group of teens to MRI devices and then asked them to identify a series of expressions on photographs of adult faces. Interestingly, while adults correctly identified one expression as fear, the teenagers thought the faces showed anger, surprise, or shock. They weren't registering subtlety as well. Not only that, but the MRI images showed that adults and teens responded with different parts of their brains. Adults used the reasonable prefrontal cortex, while the teens mostly used the gut reaction emotional amygdala located farther back in the brain. Results like these might help explain why teenagers seem to experience frequent mood swings. For one, they tend to react quickly from the emotional part of their brain without running those reactions by the more rational frontal cortex, and two, it could be that they're just misreading expressions and therefore the intentions behind them. The frontal cortex also helps people relate to and understand each other, and you can imagine what happens when concern is misjudged as anger or worry as disappointment. The Fresh Prince has an entire song about it. But the truth is, as much as parents just don't understand, teens don't always understand When the emotional amygdala and the more rational cortex aren't fully hooked up yet, that can make it hard for teenagers to productively work through emotions. This kind of reactionary, impulsive behavior may also lead to more risk-taking. Adolescence is the time when we're most likely to experiment with whatever booze, drugs, or toad licking is available, and unfortunately, it's also the time our developing brains are most vulnerable to lasting effects. Studies have shown that teens are more likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol than adults, partly because their brains are more attuned to their reward centers. While the teenage prefrontal cortex is still developing, their nucleus accumbens, or pleasure and reward zone, forms early on. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when presented with a big potential reward, teen brains light up way more than kids' or adults' brains. But if the reward was small, teen brains hardly fired at all. So basically, give an adolescent a pat on the back, and you'll get a shrug. Give them a hot date or a winning goal, and their brains light up like Vegas. This, of course, does not always result in great judgment. A jacked-up, thrill-seeking impulse combined with an exquisite pang of peer pressure, plus a new driver's license, new sex parts, and access to substances can lead to some not good results. But still, this long and sometimes tedious remodeling process that our bodies go through in the teenage years isn't all bad. Many scientists have pointed out that our delayed adolescence lets our brains keep their flexibility longer, which, yeah, may make teens a little slow, but also more adaptable as they prepare for the adult world. In this way, you can see teen impulsiveness as boldness or independent thinking, and moodiness as a source of newfound empathy, and excitability as passion. Which means there's a lot of awesome energy floating around out there ready to decrease all kinds of world suck. Thanks for watching this SciShow Infusion, and thanks especially to all of our subscribers on Subbable who make this channel possible.
All right, so one of the main things I want us to realize from that physical brain development in adolescence is that myelination. So that's happening from the brainstem, this back of your brain, basically through towards the prefrontal cortex and finishing up about age 23. So the both the pleasure center as well as the amygdala and the areas around emotion, that is actually finishing up right about its myelination, right about adolescence. So that is one of the reasons that there is more of these not understanding emotional reactions or overreactions, more intensity of emotions, because at this time in adolescence, these young people are literally feeling emotions stronger than they ever have before in their life. They're feeling emotions differently or new emotions that they haven't ever felt in their life. And so they don't have the prefrontal cortex or the practice yet of dealing with those. And so, like it mentioned, that can lead to things like more risk-taking behaviors, which can be overall a risk factor, but can be kind of pointed in more positive directions to help young people find things that they're passionate about that can have a really positive impact in their lives or the lives of people around them as well. So here we've got the kind of this very middle part. This is like right in the very center of your brain. So if you pointed at all angles around your head, that's where you'd be hitting. So you've got the amygdala, hippocampus, so that's relevant for memories, and hypothalamus and thalamus as well. So this is where emotions, reward centers, all of this stuff is finishing up its development or its myelination right at adolescence. So, yep, I just said that. So let's jump into physical development in adulthood. I know we're really jumping quickly through different aspects of the lifespan, and right now we're focused on physical development. We'll go over some specifics, like we'll focus on some other aspects of cognitive development, as well as some aspects of socio-emotional development through the lifespan, even though we've touched on them a little bit. But are there any questions about physical development during puberty and adolescence? Or that video that we just watched? All right, for most people, the peak of their physical development is in their 20s. It's often when people are the healthiest on average. So in the 30s, some physical abilities are already declining. So hearing, for example, actually begins to decline after age 18. So those high-pitched sounds, you actually start to lose the highest pitches and the hair cells that hear those highest pitches after 18. So if you compare an 18-year-old hearing to a 17-year-old to a 20-year-old, that 20-year-old will probably not be able to hear as high of notes or tones as the 18 and 17-year-old. It's pretty dramatic. In adulthood, for women in their late 40s and 50s, menopause occurs, which in some ways is actually very similar to the general overall body changes that are happening during puberty, in the sense that a lot of different hormones are happening, different bodily changes, like nutrients being used differently, fats being organized differently. So big overall changes during menopause. So things like estrogen declining, menstrual periods ceasing. So physical strength tends to decline throughout adulthood, and bones also become more and more brittle with age. So it is really important to exercise to maintain physical capacities. So, for example, the physical capacities that you might be able to just generally keep in between the ages of 20 and 25, you might need to do a lot of exercise and specific diets in between the ages of 45 and 50 to keep those same exact capacities. So you'll find that over the course of adulthood, you'll need to do more and more work to maintain those same physical capacities. So diets with nutritional foods, things like grains, whole grains, fish, vegetables are really good. Regular exercise, trying to have low stress, those are all really highly correlated with a longer life. Social connections, especially in late adulthood, are some of the biggest predictors of longer life. So having adults that are able to still do things with people around them, physically go and do activities that they like to do on their own, that they choose to do, those are all really related. So we're kind of, in this adulthood section, we're kind of combining things from early adulthood, middle adulthood, all the way through late adulthood, just because of the time we have on development. So let's talk about aging. Why do we age? So one of the ideas is a cellular clock theory. Essentially, that we have a limited times that cells can divide. So skin cells, they divide. If I'm not mistaken, bone cells can, in certain parts of your bones, divide. But anyway, a lot of our cells in our bodies divide to replace a cell. Replace themselves, essentially. Neurons don't do this, but anytime a cell divides, it limits the protective pieces of the DNA itself, because for a cell to divide, the DNA is essentially copied and then split in half, right? So for that to happen, it seems like we have a limit of number of times that can happen without having too big of mutations or damage to the DNA. So I don't think we'll watch all of this, but let's watch a little bit of this.
Getting more sleep doesn't just help you wake up refreshed in the morning. It can also literally keep you young. New studies show that those who are under stress and don't get enough shut-eye could age up to 6 times faster than they would otherwise, giving a whole new meaning to the term beauty rest. It all comes down to a part of our genetic toolkit called our telomeres. See, we're made up of approximately 30 to 40 trillion cells of human tissue, and the DNA for each of those cells is tightly coiled up into chromosomes, which are housed in the nucleus of each cell. While we're just living our lives, going about our business, our cells are replicating all the time. Every time a cell divides, the chromosomes have to be copied as one cell splits into 2 during mitosis. And during that cell replication process, telomeres act as protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes. Like, if our chromosomes are shoelaces, then telomeres are the little plastic tips on the ends of those shoelaces that keep them from fraying away. In most living things, including us, telomeres are made of hundreds to thousands of repetitions of the simple amino acid sequence TTAGGG. And this cap does a lot of things, including telling our cellular machinery where one chromosome ends and another begins. They also serve as a buffer during the copying process because cell replication isn't perfect. That little tool that does the DNA copying isn't as precise as you might hope and can't properly replicate the very ends of our chromosomes. This can cause a lot of issues and is called the end replication problem. To avoid that chop chop happening to your actual DNA, the important stuff that tells your cells what to do, your telomeres take the hit instead. And every time a cell divides, a little chunk of that telomere is lost in the process. So telomeres shorten with every cell division, but they also get shorter as you age. Like even when you're producing new cells, your telomeres are now shorter than they once were when you were young, a trend called telomere attrition. This means that your chromosomes are less protected from damage during cell replication, which is what scientists believe could be behind the decreased function and wellness of our bodies as we age, and could lead to degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. This info may now have you wondering, well, geez Louise, what do I have to do to keep my telomeres from shortening as I age?
So definitely feel free to watch all of that video because it is interesting. With the time that we have, we're not going to watch it all as a class. The answer to that was there's not really anything you can do to protect your telomeres. They are genetically designed to protect you, and once they're gone, that's too bad, essentially. So that is one theory, the cellular clock theory, essentially that cells can only divide that certain number of times because in large part of these telomeres. So let's say they can only divide 1,000 times, and then after that, they're not going to divide properly. You're going to get, as you try to divide the cells, you might get mutations or it just doesn't work at all. So that's one reason we age. Another is that oxygen molecules in cells might also damage DNA. So oxygen is actually a pretty harmful molecule for a lot of living things. It can be really caustic, essentially, destroying things. So with that, it can, when the cell just oxygen molecules shouldn't be in these areas of the nucleus, but it can happen and it can damage DNA and other cellular structures, making it so it's hard for that cell to replicate at all or for it to replicate with problems. So that over time, that tends to happen more and more over time. And so if you're older and older, that's happening more and more times as well. So another is the hormonal stress theory, that elevated levels of stress hormones might lead to things like cardiovascular disease, increased risk of cancer, and immune system decline. And when your immune system is declined, when you have cardiovascular disease, you are going to get more problems happening too, and so your body can break down from those purposes too. So essentially, all of these things together are the biological reasons of why we age. The brain aging as well. So neurogenesis, that's the creation of new neurons. And I've mentioned this a couple times today, how essentially in almost none of your brain do new stem cells become new neurons, because that's essentially how it happens. Neurons don't divide like many other cells in our body to create new neurons. Essentially, you have to have a new stem cell become a new neuron. And that only seems to happen in humans in the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb. And it doesn't really spread and migrate all over the brain, but it stays in those general areas. So some brain areas shrink as we age, such as the prefrontal cortex. Cognitive and memory abilities decrease. But if you're using those areas of the brain is plastic enough to grow new dendrites, to grow new axon branches, to keep capacities, even if you're losing a few neurons in those areas. So engaging in new and challenging cognitive tasks can help you maintain skills as you age, develop new skills. So people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, they can still do things like learn a new language, even if it's a little harder at that age. They can learn new cognitive games, new skills, learn to play instruments, things like this, things that engage the brain and are challenging. New games you can play. Those are all really, really good for keeping the performance of your brain intact. So dendrites can continue to grow up until the time you die. So you can continue to grow and develop brain capacity, cognitive abilities, all the way through the lifespan. So while we might have a lot of these physical capacities like muscle growth or muscle density losses and whatnot through adulthood, bones getting more brittle, our brains themselves can maintain a lot of their capacity all through lifespan. So I showed a graph in one of the first classes of longitudinal studies of people aging and how, in general, it's not till the early 80s that a lot of cognitive capacities really start to decline. But when you do things like new and challenging cognitive tasks, games, learning new things, trying to keep your mind engaged, those capacities can continue all throughout late adulthood. So I think this is a really optimistic way to look at development in late adulthood, rather than just assuming that, well, it's all going to go downhill, because it doesn't have to. Obviously, if there's additional problems like Alzheimer's, that can be additional risk factors. But on average, people can keep their cognitive capacities through their entire life, which I think is optimistic. All right, so let's jump over to cognitive development, and we'll kind of go through the age points for this as well. But I had hoped that we would get to socio-emotional development and be able to go on a break and then come right back to do an activity. But it's probably a good time for a break right now since we're changing from physical to cognitive development. So let's have a break right now. Let's come back to the class at about 8:45. Yeah, my clocks are accurate. So let's be back here at 8:45, go take a break, get a drink of water. I'm going to go try to put my 3-year-old back to bed because I was being too loud and he's awake. So I'll do that on my break and everybody be back here at 8:45. All right, we are back. So hopefully we can get through cognitive and socio-emotional development uh, before the end of class. I might need to skip some aspects of development because I had wanted to give groups 30 minutes today. Um, so stop at about 8 or not 8, about 9:20 or 9:30 and allow groups to be able to come together and work together for a little bit. So I'm still planning on that. Hopefully I can hit all the most important pieces before that. Oh. All right, so as you read through the chapter on development, a lot of the aspects of cognitive development focused around Piaget. So Piaget is a researcher from a couple centuries ago who had a popular theory about the stages of development of young people. So with that, we talked about our last week with development, how a lot of development happens quite continuously, not discontinuously, like in stages, but that people gain a lot of capacities just slowly over time. So these stage theories have fallen out of a lot of use now, but it was a good first step of us understanding a lot of kind of benchmarks you might expect to see from children, especially. Piaget's research didn't really go past adolescence, and he thought kind of adolescence was about the time that cognitive capacities kind of stopped developing, and that adults were essentially the same cognitively as adolescents. So we do see that there wasn't enough specificity about how infants and children learn about the world, but Piaget also didn't have the kind of research methods and tools that we have available to us now. So obviously at that time, centuries ago, there weren't these eye tracking machines you can place on a child to see what their visual preference is, as an example. So we have grown since that time. So while your book talks a lot about Piaget, I think this is a weakness in essentially all intro to psych books. Because in today, we don't actually use Piaget hardly at all. It was a good starting point, though. It helped. This last point is kind of the main thing. Piaget's research really helped guide later work. So we've moved quite a bit beyond there. So in some ways, I wish we didn't ever even talk about Piaget in intro to psych classes. It's just not really relevant anymore today. Some aspects are, and it is interesting to see like how many observations Piaget made that are still relevant today. But yeah, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine how much time is taken on Piaget, but I'm complaining here about Piaget, and that's taking more time on Piaget, so contradiction there. So now researchers, especially in cognitive psychology, are investigating more specific learning processes or specific cognitive processes. Like, how do we learn language? How do we form or process memories? There's no real big like overarching cognitive theory. The most on cognitive development specifically, the biggest developmental theories we have right now are that Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model, the idea that so many things are connected to each other and that all the contexts that are around us are affecting our development at any given point in time, and that individuals have capacities and they're affecting other people are affecting them in bidirectional interactions. So that's the overarching theory, but there's not any overarching specific cognitive developmental theory anymore. And there's a lot more neuroscience in cognitive psychology now than there used to be. So one big aspect, and we've talked about this for sensation and perception, attention is one of the biggest things in cognitive psychology, trying to understand humans. So focusing our mental resources helps us learn how to do things cognitively and is one of the main things that we need to understand. So memory specifically, and we'll have a whole chapter on memory later on, so this is a really brief overview. But memory is the retention of information over time. So we have implicit memory and explicit memory. So implicit memory is things that are memories without conscious recollection. So knowing how to use a spoon, remembering how to drive, remembering how to play guitar, things like that, or you never forget how to ride a bike. That you're referring to implicit memories there. So your brain knows how to move or do these things, versus an explicit memory is usually what we're thinking of when we say someone has a memory. I think my cat is trying to climb into cupboards. There's a bunch of stuff banging behind me, so sorry I'm distracted. But explicit memory is our conscious memories. So if we recall our first kiss or our high school graduation or something like that, we are remembering facts and experiences. So that's usually what we're thinking of. If you say, hey, can you remember this thing? We're usually talking about an explicit memory. And so most research actually suggests that explicit memory might not really exist until we're about 1.5 years old. And part of that reason is because, well, all right, well, I thought I had this question here and then the answer, but I accidentally put them both on the same slide. So, oops. So why can't you remember when you were 2? And some people might be able to some people might have memories from when they were 2, but it is very uncommon. So my earliest memories are about 4.5, and that's a little more common. 3.5 is pretty common. So generally explicit memories starting about 3.5 are pretty common, and anything earlier than 3.5 are pretty rare. So it's the reason that it seems like the reason we can't remember things before we were 2 very well is because the prefrontal cortex was still making connections and learning how to create long-term memories that your brain didn't know yet, hadn't mastered creating long-term memories. So you didn't create any long-term memories of that first year of life, essentially, and maybe even second year, or in my case, first 4 years, 3.5. My first memory is really from when I was like 4.5. So, and that's because your brain needs to learn the process of creating memories. You need to have enough dendrite connections that your brain can run through that system or run through that pattern to create a memory of something like throwing a ball, for example. You have to have the social understanding to put things in context, to understand, well, this person was talking to this person, they were talking to me. So like my parents were talking to me about throwing a ball or something like that. You need to be able to have enough experience and enough dendrite connections to be able to put all those things together into a memory. And that doesn't happen right away. So for language, that's another aspect of cognitive psychology research. So this is generally what you can see, a kind of continuous development to speaking. So making noises, understanding words, babbling, trying to use gestures like pointing to communicate what you want at about a year old, usually speaking a first word soon after a first birthday. The vocabulary, you start getting more words, and then 2-word sentences by around age 2, maybe even 3-word sentences. So that is kind of the milestones you can see. And a lot of that, again, is experience. Talking to a young child will let them have the opportunity to learn a lot more language. Speaking in multiple languages with the child, as long as you're kind of consistent in using the same couple, they will learn those languages. So children have a great capacity to learn language. So environmental influence, things like talking, reading books, especially books with grammar that's different than you use generally. So things like poems, for example. I don't speak in poetry and that kind of rhythm and whatnot. So exposing my children to, say, poems or poetry or rhymes is a really good way to get them experience with language in a different way than they will generally be exposed to with normal speech. So that can really influence and improve and quicken their language development. So child-directed speech, Another way to say this is baby talk. So child-directed speech is when people speak a little bit higher pitch, a slower tempo with more exaggerations, and it seems like this is universal. Essentially, all cultures and people speaking any language do this with young children. And it does seem to, when child-directed speech is used, it does seem to be more effective at developing language. So it is a little bit different than actual baby talk, but it is very similar. So it's not just like babbling to a baby, making strange noises. It's actually talking to them in maybe a more exaggerated and a higher pitch. If a child says dog bark, you might say, "Oh, you heard the dog barking? That's so neat. That dog's name is blah blah blah." And so you're talking to a child in a different way than you probably talk to your adult friends, is my guess. They might look at you a little funny if you tried to talk to them that way. I know when I'm, I know when my children were really young, there would be times like I might start to talk that way with friends, and they would look at me funny. Yeah, parents do tend to do these kinds of behaviors, this kind of child-directed speech, really naturally, which is really good. And it does seem to be universal across cultures around the world. So it can be really helpful for children to learn language by doing that. So tips on helping children develop language: talk with babies. So even when they're younger than, even when they're newborns, talk to them, tell them about your day, narrate things to them, talk more than you would generally talk. So letting them hear more words, describe things around them. The more experience they have with the language, the more connections they're going to be making within their neurons and picking up that language. Slow down your speech. So when you're talking to a child, especially a baby, try not to feel too funny about it. Like, I felt pretty funny using that kind of baby child-directed speech right now, but that's also because I'm talking into a microphone to adults in college, right? So I feel a little weird doing that, but it was to give an example, right? If you're doing that for a baby, that's for that baby's benefit. So don't feel as weird as I just did, is what I'm saying. Use gestures, play games, use toys at the same time. Listen to the baby. So they might just be making noises. Interact with them as they make noises. That helps teach them that, well, if you talk, someone will talk back to you, that kind of thing. Elaborate on what a baby says. That's that example we gave earlier of a child or a baby saying dog bark, and you say, "Oh, did you hear the dog barking?" So that's elaborating on what that child has said. If they say something like that's a pretty common one for children close to age 1, to like point to something and say that if they want it. And you can say, "Oh, do you want this cereal?" or "Did you want this toy?" So elaborating can be really, really helpful. So we've mentioned before in our discussion of theory of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So hopefully you remember that. But essentially, Vygotsky's theory is a social constructivist approach to learning generally. So a lot of it has to do with cognitive development. So it emphasizes the social context that people are in the learning process. So children specifically experience their environment and the people around them through a lot of social interaction. So when communicating or teaching language, that's a social interaction, right? That child is experiencing some social interaction with their parent or caregiver or peer. And so within the cultures that we're in, we might do or teach certain things, right? So we learn, essentially, Vygotsky said, the tools of a culture. So right now, my daughter has a lot of lessons in her school on English and math. So she is learning those tools of our culture. So learning how to do math, how to read a book, how to use language, how to write. We teach children how to recognize and regulate emotions. So that's what Vygotsky meant by tools of a culture, are the things that a culture does or needs to know to operate within that culture. So this is a good video on the zone of proximal development. With our time, we don't really have time right now, but I think it is a pretty easy concept to understand. Essentially, the zone of proximal development itself is this purple zone right here. So we have capacities. Every person has capacities. So things that we can do, things that we are capable of. Let's say it's learning the ukulele. What I can do is very limited in playing a ukulele. I can hold a ukulele. I know how to put my fingers on a ukulele. I know how to strum. I know a little bit about how to read music. I know a little bit more about like how to read tabs, guitar tabs. So with that, with help of say an app or a teacher, I can do a lot more. If someone shows me how to make another chord with my fingers, that'll be easier. But there are things I can't do. There are songs that I definitely can't play. There are probably techniques that I can't do with that ukulele, right? So maybe as I learn, my circle of what I can do will expand. Then that will also mean that some of the things that I can't do now, I can do with help. So the zone of proximal development is essentially the area that we can learn to do something or we can do it with help. So with some support, we are able to do that. So you can think of this as an upward spiral. So you have your capacities, you can get supported, and then you learn more and more and more. You develop some skills and abilities. That's what the zone of proximal development is all about. This is why it's a really useful model for education generally. It's still in use now, even though Vygotsky was live quite a long time ago. Well, relatively to other research that we talk about. So scaffolding is essentially trying to match the level of a child and increase their capacities. I try to do this in grading question papers, for example. So I have like these expectations, but if I see students' abilities seem to be a lot lower than those expectations, then I try to support them. Hey, this is how you can do this better, or maybe here's a video to watch, or here's another resource to read to learn how to do this task. If students' abilities are a lot more than what I was expecting, I can still help increase their abilities by saying, all right, for next time, do X, Y, and Z. So scaffolding is trying to meet someone at their level and help them grow from that point. We've talked a lot about, well, we've mentioned it a couple times, of cognition in late adulthood. So I think I'm going to skip over that right now. So this is just a reminder of the periods of development, something to know as you go into taking the exam, for example, and as well as we're talking about the prenatal period or infancy or early childhood. You sometimes might get confused of, well, what ages are there? So when we're talking about adolescence, it's this time period about to the end of the teens. Early adulthood is generally seen as ending about the early 30s. Middle adulthood is a really big span in the literature, ending at about 65. And then late adulthood is basically anything older than that. So just as a reminder. So as we talk a little bit about socio-emotional development, I think we'll get to our activity, and then after that we'll probably have to end chapter 8 today. We might try to catch up a little bit next time. We'll see. So temperament. Temperament is when we're talking, actually, no, this is useful, especially as we build up. So temperament you could think of as infant personality. It's kind of a characteristic way of how infants might respond to someone. So there are 3 classifications. Well, there are more, but these are the basic ones that we'll talk about. Easy child, difficult child, and slow to warm up child. So an easy child is an infant that has a generally positive mood, and some of the big key features are that they establish routines quickly. So what that means is their feeding schedule, they'll set a routine for that pretty quickly. They will set a routine for sleeping pretty quickly, and then they will easily adapt to new changes. So let's say you take that infant from your own home to, say, grandma's house. or an aunt's house. If a child is able to really quickly adapt to that new place, reestablish their routine or change their routine to a new routine, they would probably be considered an easy child because it's a little easier to deal with that for the adults. A difficult child reacts more negatively and cries more frequently on average, and has, this is one of the key things, has more irregular daily routines. So one day they might eat at 2, like every 2 hours, and the next day they don't eat for like 5 hours, like a big span. And another big thing is that they're more slow to adapt to change. So you take a difficult child from your house to grandma's house, they might not sleep that night. They might not eat well. It takes them a day or two to get back into their routine. And then by that time you come home from your vacation because it's so tough that now they have to reestablish a new routine back at home again. So that is a difficult child. And then a slow to warm up child generally has more of a low activity level. They don't do much. You might say, let's say you went over to your sibling to visit your new nephew or new niece. If they were just kind of boring and didn't really do anything, you might say that they're slow to warm up. So they have just kind of a low intensity of mood. Just, with this, they're not as bad at setting regular schedules, but they're not as reactive just in general, either positively or negatively. So you might see how these different temperaments might lead to a bidirectional interaction with the parents. So from easy child, difficult child, slow to warm up child, you might see what researchers who are describing these preferred for children. The easy child, a child that you can take to a new location, they'll be able to reestablish routines. It's going to be a lot more easy to have that child and be able to change routines. Versus a difficult child, that might be more frustrating for a parent. They might be more stressed. The parent might have less sleep. And so this is a bidirectional interaction. The child's temperament affects the parent's reaction, which then affects how they parent that child, which might then have a negative spiral here with a difficult child. And so that same kind of interaction can happen with attachment. So what is the relevance of the monkey in this picture? So hopefully you remember from your reading, what's the relevance of the monkey here in the picture? Yeah, so there's this doll or little robot here that's kind of the mama to this monkey, right? So what did they find, or what mamas were they comparing? There's this one that was kind of fuzzy. What was the other monkey that they were comparing it to? Great answer, Destiny. Thank you. So the monkey has an attachment to the cloth mother. The researchers gave the monkey a different mother that was more like a box, you said. So one was essentially the same, except it was just wire. You can kind of see it here. It was just kind of a wire frame. So one was a wire frame monkey with no like softness on top of it, and the other had this basically blanket placed on top of it. They also put like a light bulb in it, so it was warm. But yeah, so they had this little robot monkey for these new baby monkeys to either cuddle up with. And so the wire one, they had nipples with food. in. So it could get food from the wire monkey, but it could only get like a warm cuddle from this kind of monkey, from the soft one. And so this was a test to see, well, which monkey would the babies stay with? Obviously, they need to eat, right? If the baby monkey does not eat, it's going to die. So they hypothesized that it might stay with that wire mother more than the soft, fluffy mother. But what they found was that most of the baby monkeys stayed essentially all the time with the warm, fuzzy mother and felt safer there. They seemed, or they, based on their behavior, it seemed like they were feeling safer with this soft, warm mother as opposed to the one that actually gave them food. So the food didn't really matter that much. They ate it to, they went over to that mother to eat, and then they came back to this mother. So what they surmised from that is, well, maybe attachment is really important in all primates, including humans. And so you can see here from this graph the time that they spent on the wire mother versus cloth mother. So attachment is similar to this. It's the emotional bond of closeness between two people. Usually in the research on attachment, it's a child and their mother, but there has been research on children and their fathers, children and their grandparents, children and long-term babysitter caregivers. So attachment is that close emotional bond between people. And so again, most of the research we're describing here is about mothers and children, but it also applies to fathers, siblings, grandparents, and other caregivers. So there's essentially 4 phases of attachment. In a direct attachment to others in the first 2 months, attachment becomes, well, honestly, with the time we have, this is good to know if you're going to go into more attachment research. But for our purposes, we want to know about a couple different classifications of attachment, and then our activity, which I think based on the time we'll probably do first thing next time, this group activity. So attachment in human children is often measured through this strange situation. Essentially, you bring a child into a strange kind of situation, and this child goes through a series of interactions with a stranger as well as their caregiver, and you observe what they do. So in the strange situation, you have the parent or the caregiver and the child come into a room. Usually it's a laboratory, it's a controlled setting. They generally have like a camera to watch the child, some toys, things like that. So the child comes in and should go around and explore. They watch the interactions of the parent and the child, or the caregiver and the child, and how the child interacts with the caregiver as well as the things in the room. Then a little while later, a stranger comes in. So you can watch the interaction with the child and the parent there, and the child and the stranger. Then after a little bit, the parent just leaves. So usually isn't supposed to give any warning, just kind of leaves. And then watches what the child does. Does the child cry? Does the child not care that the parent has now left and they're left in there with a stranger? The stranger, depending on how they're doing the process, the stranger might try to interact with the child, like play with toys, try to calm the child down. Then after a while, the parent will come back, and then depending on the way that they're doing it, the parent might leave the child alone after a little while, and then maybe a stranger will come in by itself. So with this whole situation, depending on how many stages they go through, whether all 4 or all 6, it lasts anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes with a child. And so with that, an observer is trying to watch and gauge how attached that child is to their caregiver. So they watch if there's positive interactions between the child and the caregiver, if the child feels safe in the room to explore, if the child is really afraid of the stranger, or if the child wants to go back to the parent after they come back. And so based on that, we've got a couple different classifications for attachment of human children. One is secure attachment, which you might imagine is correlated to the most positive outcomes. So in this kind of situation, the child uses the caregiver as a secure base. So they feel comfortable with the caregiver, and they might look back to the caregiver or ask the caregiver to come and play with toys. But the child feels comfortable enough with the caregiver being there that they will go and explore. They will do things around the room. And this is relevant also to social behaviors too. A securely attached child tends to be a little more outgoing. They feel safe with the attachments that they have to their caregiver at home. And let's say you take them to a daycare or in a group with other kids, they'll also go and explore with those other kids. Then another thing you want to look for is that the child might cry when the parent leaves, but when the parent comes back from being gone, they'll quickly have more positive interactions with that caregiver. They'll be able to calm down. They'll be able to get back to playing, those kinds of things for a securely attached child. Versus an insecure avoidant child will show that they're insecure by generally avoiding the caregiver, even right at the beginning. They don't really want to have the caregiver involved in play. They don't have a lot of interaction. They might not even seem to care when the caregiver leaves. They might not cry. They might see it, but not really seem to do anything. And then they usually don't try to reestablish a connection with the caregiver when the caregiver comes back in this stage 4. They might even move away from the caregiver at that time. So insecure resistant is a little strange. They will try to cling to the caregiver, but also resist that closeness. It's almost as if they're not secure in that attachment. They cannot rely on that caregiver always being there. They want that closeness, but they know they can't actually rely on it. You can kind of think of it that way. They usually don't try to explore the room and toys, and they'll often cry really loudly and be really distressed when the parent leaves. But even when the parent comes back, they won't calm down very well. They can be really, really hard to soothe, and they won't accept that comfort. Even if the parent comes back and is like, hey, I'm back, I'm here for you, the child might still be really upset even from that, and then not get back to playing. So we've got secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant. There's also insecure disorganized. There's a couple other classifications that more modern research has found, but these are the ones that we'll focus on for our purpose. So disorganized is kind of the category that Mary Ainsworth kind of piled everybody in that didn't really fit those other 3 categories. The child might appear dazed and confused or fearful, might show avoidance patterns or resistant behavior, but this was found to be a really rare attachment style. So this has actually been broken up into other attachment styles, as well as insecure, resistant, and avoidant have kind of been classified in different ways more recently. But I think for our purposes at this level of just beginning to learn about attachment, this is some good descriptions. Secure attachment, knowing that a child will use the caregiver as a secure base, explore around a room, cry when a parent leaves, but be able to calm down when they come back and get back to playing. These are all important aspects of secure attachment. And you might imagine how a child who's securely attached versus insecurely attached might interact with their world differently. So if they're insecurely attached to their caregiver and they don't feel like exploring toys, well, maybe they're not going to explore with more friends. Maybe they won't have as many experiences with toys to have more gross motor or fine motor skills developed quickly. So attachment can affect a lot of cognitive as well as socio-emotional development. So next time another big thing that we can definitely touch on today is that attachment is another one of those bidirectional interactions. So if you have a secure attachment with a child and that child is securely attached with you, generally you'll have more positive interactions with them. But if there's an insecure attachment, that child might not trust that parent growing up. That mistrust or not thinking that they can rely on that parent might continue on and lead to other socio-emotional development problems. So infants can learn how to regulate their emotions within those attachment pairs. So infants can learn how to regulate their stress, their anxiety, their fear by relying on someone else, right? So a parent like picking them up and cuddling them or something can help them learn how to calm down. But if that's not happening, they're going to have a harder time learning that. They definitely still can, but it's going to be a little harder. Having these secure attachments, having these socio-emotional experiences early in childhood helps start these developing neural pathways for just general interactions with other people, as well as how to do things like regulate emotions. Interestingly, in regards to dating and friends, people tend to pick partners later on in life who they then share attachment styles. So if you've got two people who are securely attached to their caregivers in childhood, they will tend to like find each other because they're expecting a close bonded relationship that's secure. That's what they're expecting. That's what they're looking for. That ends up being who they date long term, for example. Versus if you look at two people who are insecure resistant, they might really want that closeness with their partner, but also resist that closeness. You might see this in like increased jealousy in a relationship, or being really distressed over little things, and then hard to soothe or hard to get over things, even if things are fixed or problems in the relationships are fixed. So it's just kind of an interesting finding that on average, people pick partners that they have the same attachment level or attachment style with. So that can be really good and positive for two people with secure attachment. It can lead to some more troubles in, say, insecure attachments to a partner. That being said, people can change their attachment style. On average, about 75% of people keep their same attachment style throughout their entire life, but there's that 25% who don't. If, let's say, someone who is insecure resistant gets in a long-term relationship with someone who had a secure attachment with their parents, so that person is expecting the secure relationship, they know how to respond to someone in a secure manner. The person with insecure resistant attachment can, over time, change their attachment style, now have a secure attachment style with that partner, now seek out secure attachments with other people. So it's not, attachment has a lot of impact on socio-emotional development throughout childhood and adolescence and adulthood, but it definitely can change. You can also see it change in children who are adopted. So if they have an insecure attachment to their biological parents, after their adoption, or maybe certain foster families, for example, they might have a secure attachment and then develop that and keep that the rest of their life. So they're very interesting. So definitely before next class period, I would encourage you, and we'll probably go through it again. So these kinds of things that you would look for in a secure attachment, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and disorganized. Because next time we will come and do a group activity where we essentially watch some attachment examples. I think they're right here. Yeah. So don't watch them in advance. I mean, I guess you could. It's not going to hurt anything. We'll watch them as a class. Then as your little groups, essentially, you'll decide what kind of attachment style they are. You'll make a rubric for what you should look for in insecure or insecure avoidant, and so on. And then we'll do that. But because of the time, I think we will actually break into our groups for our group presentations. So it's still pretty early in the semester. So at this point, hopefully everybody in your group has contacted each other, knows who each other are. So with your time today, hopefully you can go and make reading assignments, or even start making assignments for outlining slides, make a next time where you're going to meet. Remember, you can always meet here in the Google Teams space, so you're remote. You don't have to meet physically in person with each other. Maybe I might even not even recommend that with a pandemic going on, right? But you can definitely meet in this team space, or use something like Google Hangouts or Zoom or anything that you want. You can just text synchronously. You could all meet up and work on a Google Slides document together at the same time. So 2 things to do today: make sure everybody has read, or at least make plans to read, the sections in the textbook that cover your content, and then make an appointment for the next time you're all going to meet together, and set some assignments or like roles within your group. So if you get more than that done, or if you've already done that and you can go on to a next step of starting to create slides even, that would be great too. But I'll still be here like hanging out to field any questions you and your group have. And oh no, I totally forgot to make those separate groups in the teams. So that's probably the easiest way to do that since we don't have all the groups. So what I had planned to do before class today, hopefully you see this screen, is in this Teams area. So we've got this classroom group, A through E, F through L, M through P, Q through Z. You and your group jump into one of those boxes. So maybe just in the general chat say, hey, my group, we're going to go into this room, or just let's start texting right now, or something like that. I'll definitely make some classroom groups for each individual group. So sorry I didn't do that. Sorry, I forgot to do that. All right, so you have the next little bit of class. That's the end of this aspect of class. I will still be here in this team meeting area to field any question, but jump off with your groups. You can just have a meeting chat in this meeting chat, or jump over to another service or anything like that. So thank you all for coming today to this meeting. Get to work in your groups, because even though the due date's not till the end of the semester, time goes quick during these semesters and things will get busy towards the end. So thank you all for being here. Next time we'll do this group activity and finish up chapter 8 and go to chapter 11. Pretty sure. Yeah, chapter 11. All right, have a good night.